Today we're going to take a look at the work of Australian artist Harold Septimus Power and how he used brushwork to show form in his subjects. Today we're taking a look at the brushwork of Harold Septimus Power. He was an Australian artist born in 1877 and died in 1951. Early on, he worked as an illustrator before going to art school in Paris in 1905, and he studied there for a few years. Then when he returned to Australia in 1911, he had his first one-man show where he displayed oils and watercolor. And then during World War I, he became a war artist known for his horse paintings, which I think that was his main subject, was horses. His father was a veterinarian, so that might have had something to do with his choice of subject matter. But I want to talk about brushwork here and three things to think about when we're thinking about brushwork. First one is to simplify. The idea that less is more. Second is thick paint. And then third is following the form of our subject with the brushes. So starting first with the idea of simplifying. That takes in a lot. You can see here in his paintings, the rocks in the background, the middle ground are very simple. The less simple, the more detailed, is reserved for the focal point. In this case, the trees, maybe a little bit of this rock here, but everything else is simplified. And the bigger the brush stroke, the bigger the brush, the more simple your subject is going to look. The idea that painting everything you see, all the detail you can see in a reference or from life, it does not make for a better painting. The hard part and the better part is to learn how to simplify, get rid of what's unnecessary, and see things as bigger, simpler masses rather than tiny details. Not that there is no detail in a good painting. There is. We have to have some detail, but you have to learn where to put it, where is it best used, and where to eliminate it. So as we move more into his horse subjects here, horse and landscape, some figurative, you can see the bigger, simpler shapes, just a smaller horse study. But it reads well because things are kept big and simple. And you can tell he's using a bigger brush. The rule is, if you want to think of it as a rule, use as big a brush as possible. So even when you're doing detail, see how big of a brush you can get away with. Because the tinier the brush, it just looks like tiny brush strokes. It doesn't hold up as well as using a larger brushwork. In art school, if we were too picky, seeing too much detail, the teacher would have us use just a number 12, and we were painting the figure or a head. I got pretty good at turning that number 12 brush on the edge or the point and being able to do detail with a bigger brush. And it just reads better when detail is applied with a bigger brush as opposed to a smaller one. It may not make sense, but after doing it for a while, you can see the simplicity of the background and reserving the detail for the focal point, which is more the heads of the horses, and kind of the upper body. Everything else is much more simple. And then he's following the form of the horses with the brushstroke. In other words, these brushstrokes aren't just vertical brushstrokes or horizontal. He's following the form or the shape of the horses with the brushstroke and using thicker paint. Thicker paint is much more expressive, has a lot more excitement, vitality to it. Plus, thicker paint shows the color better. Thin paint, whether it's thinned down with a lot of medium or paint thinner, that kind of kills the color as well as the boldness of a brushstroke. Now, you don't necessarily start off right away with real thick paint. You can build up to it, blocking things in a little thinner at first, and then coming back in your lights and building them up. You do want thinner darks and thicker lights That contrast of thick and thin paint gives the painting a lot more depth also. Here's a small little landscape, but again, the brushwork is simplified. It's kind of following the form, these vertical trees, vertical shrubbery. They don't look rounded, the shrubbery, they look vertical up and down because of his brushwork. Here on the tree trunk, he's following the form in a lot of his brush strokes to make it look more rounded. But again, use as big a brush as possible and put the brush down and follow the form with one brush stroke as opposed to picking the brush up 3 or 4 times. In other words, paint a shape with as few brush strokes as possible. Less is more as far as brush strokes go. And when you can do that, you can describe the form with fewer brush strokes. It just works a lot better. Same thing with watercolor, and I'm not a watercolorist, so I do know that the bigger the brush stroke in watercolor and the more full of water it is, the bigger the shape, the more variation in the value change of the color or of the shape you get. And the smaller brush strokes just gives you a lot of picky little value changes which don't help the painting. But it did both watercolor and oil really well. Here again, we look at the simplicity, the background shapes, very simple. The trees, the middle ground, the fields, all kept really simple. And the brush strokes with thick paint, again, make a decision of what value you're going to mix, what color it is, and then put it on thick. Even if you're unsure, put it on thick and definite, because it's better to be more definite with a real definite brush stroke than it is to timidly kind of tap away at it. Get used to being bolder with your brush strokes to make a bigger statement in the painting, because small brush strokes are reserved for that one area where you're going to have some detail, like in the sheep here or up in the foliage on top. All the rest is kept real simple with simple brush strokes that, again, in case of the fields and the mountains, it's following the form, kind of half rounded to show the trees, even following the form here of these tree trunks, which is more detailed, more stuff going on, but still they're bigger brush strokes. They're not tiny little picky brush strokes that can really make a shape fall apart quickly. Another small landscape, probably painted outside. In the further back, away from the roof and the foreground tree, the further back you go, the more simple the brush strokes are. And you can see again, they're not flat or straight brush strokes. He's following the form here on the field or hill. Same thing here, it goes this way. So kind of counterbalancing brush strokes that kind of weave in and out with each other, given the feel of that form or the rolling hills back in there. Same thing with the tree. The tree trunk's more vertical, upright, so the brush strokes are more vertical and upright. Not that you couldn't do some short horizontal brush strokes to show the form. You could do some, but it's that vertical brush stroke that shows the height of the tree and the form of it. Another watercolor, in the big shapes, you can see the background trees on the hill is just a wet shape where he drops in a little bit of maybe slightly muted blue violet just to fill in. That's that idea of big, simple brush strokes as opposed to tiny ones. He's got the tiny ones here around the tree, and that's it. A little bit on the horse. But as you move away from the focal point, shapes are bigger, more simple, and they just read better. And if we're not sure what to do, I think the default is always to go with a smaller brush, thinner paint, and tiny detail. Because that's what we see is the detail. It's hard to know what's underneath the detail of a reference or outside. But the more you paint, the more you understand. It's about starting with those bigger, simpler shapes, about 4 to 6 big shapes or masses using big brush strokes, keeping things simple. And then at the end, deciding where the detail is going to be. Again, probably a smaller painting of a study of some horses and how simple he keeps everything, except for the horses. Horses have the detail. And I think the more you can create a big, simple block in that first stage of the painting, where you're just filling in the big areas, in 1 to 2 values, big simple brushstrokes following the form, then what to do with detail comes a bit more naturally. So learn how to simplify and block in a painting. And I think from that, understanding detail is a lot easier. Too often we want to know how to do detail right away. Spend a lot of time doing a lot of block ins where you don't worry about detail at all. And when that becomes more second nature, of simplifying the block in with bigger brush strokes, then how to handle detail, I think, makes more sense. It just comes a bit more naturally. Because you can learn about tricks and techniques, with certain kinds of brushes to do different things. But if you don't understand the block in stage of simplifying and how to use thick paint, the idea of detail will never make any sense. But you can see here again, the background, sky, very, very simple. And eventually building up the lights with thick paint. Then he has the detail on the horses and some in the foreground. So some smaller brush strokes, but my guess is this detail in the grass in the foreground and in the dirt is done with a bigger brush that's just loaded with paint and kind of turned on the edge to get a smaller stroke. Again, as opposed to a tiny rounded brush. Not to say you can't use them, doing some of the smaller things on the horse, the reins or the halter. Maybe you need a smaller brush to do some of that. But use as big a brush as possible to see what you can get away with when you're trying to do detail. But the simplicity in these trees in the background, really nice. That makes the foreground horses really stand out. If you get too detailed in the background, the horses won't stand out. They'll sink in. The background detail will come forward and make the horses look more muddled. Another watercolor, and the simplicity here, the shapes, really nice. Seeing the shrubbery in front is a mass, very high key, meaning the shadows in the lights are very light. A lot of his watercolors were more of a high key value range. Another nice simplicity in the landscape, having a lot of these hay bales in front, more detailed. A lot of detail in front here. More detail in front is going to pull that forward and allow the more simple stuff to recede, because simplicity will go back to the background and more detail will come forward. So it works really, really nicely. And massing things together with big strokes, big brush strokes, like the horse here, which is in shadow, the shadow of the hay bales, the shadow on the ground, that's all one big shape. So before you distinguish which is a hay bale and which is a horse, see it as a big mass and shape with as big a brush as possible. Learn how to see big masses and shapes. And we always did that with smaller paintings, 8 by 10, using a 6 or 8 brush, trying to keep things as big and as simple as possible. You can almost get a shadow pattern of all these trees. They're all in dark, one big shape, abstract pattern that winds around and connects the shadow in the hay, the shadow of the horse. It's all one big shadow pattern that makes up the composition. And when you can see that or create that out of something that's somewhat close to that, in other words, compositions aren't always created perfectly for you. You got to simplify things and pull them together and make it work a bit more. So close up here of some real nice stuff going on in this white horse, the reflected light, the reflection of the sky, and more of the top planes of the horse. And the brushwork looks like it's all feathered out and he's going over it and over it. My guess is he's not. As you can see, the brush strokes are following the form of the muscle structure. Now, it's not real thick, but it's thick enough that the color makes an impact. Thin paint doesn't give much impact color-wise. And the lights, thicker than the darks. That contrast of thick against thin does give, in this case, the horse a lot more form. Because if your brush strokes or your paint quality is all the same thickness or thinness, it can kind of flatten the form a little bit. Bigger painting, a lot going on. So the only way to paint something like this is bigger, more simple brush strokes. Learn to put away the small brush and use big ones. So when you look at all the legs of the horses, I mean, you could draw all the horse legs That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 horses, so 6 times 4, 24. You could draw 24 legs in there and draw the water that shows in between and the hoofs. But it's much better to see the legs, and the bottom part down here is all one big dark shape. Then break up that dark shape with the negative shape of like the water between the legs. You can see a dark shape in here, just broken up with a few lighter spots in there. So he's suggesting detail instead of first outlining everything and then filling it in. He's starting with as big a shape as possible, then using negative shapes to suggest legs. And that's hard to do at first, but the more you can see things that way, the easier it becomes. Then you're not relying on outlining everything. Now, I do a lot of outlining early on in the painting, but where I can move to shape instead of outline, I find it a lot easier, and the drawing's a lot more accurate that way. It's a whole nother lesson in itself, how important it is to see shape instead of outline. Here, the simplicity of these hay bales and the background trees in the sky allows him to do the more detailed work on the horses. And again, detail is just value changes. Like on the white horse here within the shadow, he's got 1, 2, 3, probably 4 value changes, and that's detail. And the detail of the smaller values of the halter, dark against the lighter horse. That's detail, and you want to restrict it to a minimum, just what's important, and keeping it just in the area where you want to draw the viewer's attention. You know, it's important to show the backlighting back here and the trees, and it's also really important to show it really simple. Doesn't need much detail in the background. And when we look at something, I think that's a more natural way of thinking of detail. When I'm looking at something, I really only see the detail of where I'm focusing my eyes. If I'm focusing my eyes at the horse, I don't see the detail in the background trees as much. So you want to paint the same way. Paint the detail where you want the viewer's eye to focus and lose the detail everywhere else. Here's a figure. It's not real big. But again, you can see there's a lot going on with the stuff in the shop, but I'm sure he's simplified it, left out tons of things instead of just trying to put in everything. And again, the more you can mass things into shape, instead of trying to render the stuff that's under the table here, or render too much the stuff that's on the windowsill, see it more as just shape, using positive and negative shapes to suggest something that's there instead of trying to be too literal. Another one here, again, simple background, simple foreground. Maybe a small painting from life outside. So it didn't have much time to mess it up with detail. The thick paint and the definite brushstrokes make the painting work a lot better than small brushes with thin paint that are kind of tentative with the brushstrokes. Better to be really bold with the brushstroke and be wrong than to be right and kind of timid with it. A real definite brushstroke where you put it down like you know what you're doing will always look better than something that's a bit more picky. Last one here is a watercolor. But even with watercolor, the simplicity of the shape is really important. Again, not a watercolorist, but I do know that the bigger the watercolor brush and the more simple you can keep the shapes, the better the painting will read. So remember, brushwork wise, 3 things: simplify the shapes with big brushes, big brush strokes, use thick paint, and follow the form with the brushwork.